I am Michael Carter, a man well past 50, raised on Midwest roads where winters were long, words were honest, and a handshake still meant something. And I am telling this story myself because no headline, no rumor, no legal document could ever explain what it feels like to stand in a room full of people while your life collapses politely around you. And I want you to understand from the first breath of this story that what happened to me was not sudden, not accidental, and not the result of weakness, but the result of trusting the wrong person for too long and staying calm long enough for the truth to walk out on its own legs. Because that night, under crystal lights and polished marble floors in a downtown hotel ballroom, my wife Laura laughed while handing me divorce papers at her luxury brand launch party. And the sound of that laugh still echoes in my chest when the room is quiet, because it was not just laughter, it was confidence, certainty, the sound of someone who believed they had already won. And as the guests smiled awkwardly, unsure if this was part of the show or something deeply wrong, she leaned into the microphone and told everyone I was finished, told them she was finally free, told them the house was hers, the car was hers, the circle of friends was hers, and I was nothing more than a chapter she had outgrown. And while people clapped out of confusion or loyalty or fear of being on the wrong side of power, I stood there holding those papers, feeling my pulse steady instead of racing, because somewhere deep inside me, a quiet voice said this was not the end. This was only the moment where the lie became loud enough to be noticed later. And as humiliating as that moment was, as small as I felt standing there in a suit I had worn to support her, I did not shout, I did not argue, I did not expose her right then, because years earlier, long before that party, long before the success and the distance and the coldness, I had learned something about patience the hard way, back when we were still pretending to be partners. Back when I noticed the changes that everyone else ignored, the way she stopped asking my opinion, the way her phone never left her hand, the way conversations turned shallow and transactional, and I told myself it was ambition, told myself I was being old-fashioned, told myself that love meant giving space even when it hurt, because I had built my life on the idea that loyalty was an investment that always paid off. Eventually, and during those years, I quietly became the background of her story, the steady husband people assumed would always be there. And that invisibility was what saved me, because in that space I noticed things like an email she sent late one night that landed in my inbox by mistake. An email full of careful words about assets, timing, and signatures, about making sure everything looked clean when the announcement came. And I remember staring at that screen with my coffee going cold, feeling the first real crack in my chest, not anger yet, just understanding. And instead of confronting her, instead of tipping my hand, I forwarded that email to a private account and left it there untouched, like a seed planted in dry soil, because something told me I would need it one day. And life went on, the way it always does when you are pretending not to see what is right in front of you, until that night at the launch party when the pretending ended publicly, and after the laughter faded and the guests drifted back to their drinks, I walked out alone into the night air, feeling strangely clear, because humiliation has a way of burning away confusion. And in the weeks that followed, Laura moved fast, faster than I thought possible, changing locks, shifting money, rewriting history with social posts and carefully chosen smiles. And people I had known for decades suddenly stopped calling, as if her confidence had rewritten the truth for them too. And I let them go, all of them, because chasing people who already decided you were done only drains energy you will need later. And while the world thought I had gone silent out of defeat, I was quietly reconnecting with a man who had been present years earlier during a signing Laura barely remembered. A witness who remembered the conversation, remembered the intent, remembered that the document she signed was not just a formality, and that signature, combined with that old email and that one witness, formed a triangle of truth that did not need drama to stand. And I took my time, because I was not interested in revenge that felt good for 5 minutes. I wanted resolution that lasted. And the moment finally came months later at another polished event where Laura stood smiling, confident that the past was buried, confident that I was broken. And when the truth was calmly presented, not shouted, not dramatized, just laid out piece by piece, the room changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, smiles froze, and Laura's face drained of color as she realized that the story she had been telling everyone was missing critical pages. And in that stillness, I felt something unexpected, not joy, not satisfaction, but peace, because justice, real justice, is quiet. And when everything settled, when the assets returned, when the whispers replaced applause, I did not celebrate. I went home, sat alone, and understood something that took me over 50 years to learn, that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest protection a person can have, that silence is not surrender, And that truth does not rush, it waits. And if there is one thing I want you to carry with you after hearing my story, it is this: never confuse calm with weakness, and never laugh at someone you believe is finished, because you have no idea what they have kept, who remembers the truth, or how long they are willing to wait for it to speak. Before that night ever arrived, before the applause curdled into whispers and my name started feeling like something people stepped around instead of speaking aloud, I was simply Michael, 52 years old, carrying a bad knee from too many years of climbing in and out of trucks and warehouses, a calm voice shaped by decades of problem solving, and a stubborn belief that marriage was not supposed to feel easy all the time but was supposed to be honored anyway. And I had built my life the slow, American way, the way my father taught me without ever sitting me down for a lecture, by watching him wake up before sunrise, drink his coffee in silence, and go to work no matter how he felt. And I followed that pattern into adulthood, working long hours, driving long miles, missing birthdays and holidays, not because I did not care but because I believed providing was a language of love. And by the time I met Laura, I already knew who I was: not flashy, not loud, not the kind of man who filled a room, but the kind who kept it standing. And in the early years she seemed to understand that, even admire it, because she would squeeze my hand at dinner parties when I stayed quiet. She would smile when I fixed something instead of calling for help, and she would tell her friends that I was dependable, solid, the kind of man who made her feel safe in a world that never slowed down. And I wore that label proudly, because by my 40s I had learned that excitement burns fast, but steadiness keeps you warm for life. And when we married, I truly believed we were partners, not equal in personality but equal in commitment. And for a long time that belief held, through small apartments, through job changes, through years where money was tight and years where it finally loosened its grip. And during all that time Laura started changing in ways that felt natural at first, like a person discovering confidence, discovering ambition, discovering a hunger for something bigger than the life we had quietly built. And when she came to me with the idea of launching her own luxury brand, talking fast, eyes bright, hands moving as if the future was already alive in front of her, I did not feel threatened, I felt proud, because I thought this was simply the next chapter, her turn to dream, while I stood behind her the way she had once stood behind me. And without hesitation I opened doors I had earned access to over decades, signed checks that represented years of my labor, introduced her to people who trusted my word without question. And I stayed out of the spotlight because that felt natural to me, because love, in my mind, meant letting someone you cared about shine, even if it meant you became part of the background. And for a long time that arrangement felt right, almost noble, because she would come home buzzing with stories and I would listen, nodding, asking questions, feeling like I was part of something growing, even if my name was not on the banner. But slowly I could barely pinpoint when it started, something shifted. The gratitude softened into expectation, the warmth into distraction, the shared jokes into polite smiles, and I noticed she stopped asking my opinion, stopped checking in, stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as furniture. Always there, useful but unnoticed. And I told myself it was stress, told myself success changes people temporarily, told myself a man my age should not be insecure, because I had been raised to believe that if you did your job and stayed loyal, things would settle back into place. But instead the house began to feel unfamiliar, like a place where my footsteps were too loud and my presence slightly inconvenient. And dinners became quiet, conversations turned shallow, and when I spoke about my day she listened the way people listen to background noise, waiting for it to end. And still I stayed steady, still I showed up, still I fixed things, paid bills, made room for her ambitions, because that was who I believed myself to be, the man who held things together even when the glue stopped sticking. And looking back now, I can see that I was slowly being rewritten out of her story long before she ever laughed at me in public. But at the time I could not imagine that the woman who once leaned her head on my shoulder during late-night television, who once told people I was her anchor, would one day stand under bright lights and treat my life like a punchline. And if there is tragedy in this part of the story, it is not that I loved her too much, it is that I believed being steady was enough to keep someone who had already started chasing a different version of themselves. And before the laughter ever echoed through that ballroom, before the whispers ever followed me, I was a man who believed loyalty was permanent, that effort was noticed, and that staying in the shadows for someone you loved was a choice that would always be honored. Never realizing that shadows are also where people learn how easy it is to pretend you are no longer there. People like to talk about betrayal as if it arrives with sirens and warning lights, as if one day you wake up and everything is suddenly different. But that is not how it really happens, at least not the kind that breaks you slowly from the inside. Because the truth is, betrayal usually whispers long before it ever shouts. And for me it began in silence, the kind of silence that feels harmless at first, The kind you excuse because life is busy and people change. And Laura started coming home. Later than usual, not dramatically late, just late enough to explain away. Late enough that dinner went cold once or twice. Late enough that I told myself she was building something important and that I should be proud instead of suspicious. And her phone became a constant companion, always face down on the table, always tucked close to her body. And I noticed it but pretended not to, because I did not want to become the kind of man who counted minutes or questioned every vibration. And conversations that once flowed easily, conversations about dreams, frustrations, plans, and even silly nothing moments, slowly turned into polite exchanges that felt more like check-ins than connections. And I would ask how her day was, and she would give me a summary instead of a story. Efficient, emotionless, like a report, and I told myself this was stress, that big dreams came with big pressure, that ambition demanded focus, and that a man my age should not feel threatened by his wife's success. So I swallowed the small knot in my chest and smiled, because smiling felt easier than confronting something I could not yet name. And there were moments, small but sharp, when I noticed she stopped asking for my opinion on things that once mattered. Decisions she used to talk through with me were suddenly already made. And when we attended events together, I was introduced less and less, sometimes not at all, and I would find myself standing slightly behind her while she spoke, nodding politely as if I were a guest instead of her husband. And her new circle of friends, people who came with her growing success, looked through me instead of at me, their eyes sliding past as if I were part of the furniture. And I felt invisible in rooms where I used to feel grounded, and still I stayed because I had already invested half my life into this marriage, and walking away felt like admitting that all those years had been a mistake. And I was raised to believe you fix things. You do not abandon them when they become inconvenient. You double down, you show patience, you prove your worth through consistency. And so I worked harder at being easy to live with, easier to ignore, quieter, less demanding, telling myself that love sometimes meant endurance. And I remember nights lying in bed listening to her type on her phone, the glow lighting up her face, and feeling a strange mix of loneliness and guilt for even noticing, because I did not want to be the man who doubted his wife. I wanted to be the man who trusted her completely. And the truth, the part that stings the most to admit now, is that the signs were all there, lined up in front of me like caution tape, and I stepped over them one by one because I wanted peace more than truth, because truth threatened the life I believed I had built. And what I did not understand then was that while I was trying to fix us by being patient, by being steady, by being quiet, she was already planning how to remove me. Not in anger, not in chaos, but carefully, quietly, legally, and eventually with an audience. And the betrayal was not just in what she did later. It was in the months and years before, when she slowly rewrote our roles without telling me, when she treated my loyalty like a weakness and my silence like permission. And love has a dangerous way of blinding even a smart man when he wants something to be true more than he wants to be right, because admitting the cracks meant admitting that the woman I trusted was already standing on the other side of a door I was still trying to hold open. And by the time I realized how wide that gap had become, she was no longer walking away quietly. She was preparing to make sure everyone saw her leave me behind. There is always one moment in a person's life that looks ordinary while it is happening but later reveals itself as the hinge on which everything turns. And for me that moment came quietly on a dull afternoon years before any divorce papers were ever printed. On a day that felt so normal it almost disappeared into memory. When I sat at my desk at home, knee aching, coffee cooling beside me, doing something as boring as cleaning out an old email inbox I had ignored for too long. Clicking through spam, forgotten receipts, outdated newsletters, and meaningless threads from people I barely remembered, thinking about nothing more serious than freeing up space, when suddenly my eyes caught a subject line that didn't belong there. A line that made my stomach tighten before I even opened it, because it carried Laura's name in a tone that felt off, and when I clicked it open my hands went cold in a way I still remember clearly, because the words on the screen were not meant for me, not meant for my eyes. And yet there they were, careful, deliberate sentences sent by my wife to someone she assumed would always stay in the shadows, talking about a deal that wasn't public, a quiet agreement that was supposed to stay invisible until the right moment, mentioning assets being shifted early, mentioning timing and signatures, mentioning how everything needed to look clean and simple when the big announcement finally came. And I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling my heart pound in my ears because nothing about that email sounded accidental or harmless. It sounded planned, rehearsed, calculated, and my first instinct, the instinct of the man I had always been, was to call her immediately, to ask what this meant, to give her the chance to explain, to tell me I was misunderstanding something. But I didn't because something deeper stopped me, Something quiet and steady that told me once you ask a question like that, you can never unask it, and I wasn't ready to watch her lie to my face or tell the truth that would end the life I still believed in. So instead I sat there, reading the email again and again, noticing the choice of words, the absence of emotion, the way it read like a strategy memo instead of a conversation. And I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation, because believing that felt safer than accepting the alternative. But at the same time I knew, deep down in a place I didn't want to visit yet, that innocent explanations don't usually need that much care, that much secrecy, that much forward planning. And without making a big decision, without drama, without even standing up from my chair, I did something small that would later change everything. I forwarded that email to a secure account I rarely used, labeled it in a way only I would understand, and left it there untouched, not because I was planning revenge, not because I was thinking about divorce, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because an instinct I had learned to trust over 50 years of living whispered that this wasn't over, that someday I might need proof of a truth I wasn't strong enough to face yet. And after that I closed my laptop, stood up, and went back to my day as if nothing had happened, fixing things around the house, making dinner, listening to her talk about her projects that evening with the same enthusiasm she always had, nodding, asking questions, playing my role so well that even I almost forgot what I had read. But from that day on, something invisible stood between us, a wall built not from anger or resentment but from awareness, from the knowledge that there was a version of my wife's life I wasn't invited into anymore, and that awareness changed how I listened, how I watched, how I remembered details. And while on the outside nothing seemed different, on the inside I had crossed a line I could never uncross, because once you see the possibility of betrayal, you can never fully return to blind trust. And yet I did not become bitter or cold. I did not accuse or withdraw. I simply observed, quietly storing moments, conversations, and inconsistencies the way a man stores tools he hopes he will never need. And the strange thing is that for a long time I almost forgot about that email. Not because it wasn't important, but because life kept moving and it was easier to pretend it was nothing, easier to believe that love and time would smooth everything out. But that message stayed, where I left it, waiting patiently, like a witness that never sleeps. And when years later I stood in that ballroom holding divorce papers while my wife laughed and the room clapped, it was that ordinary afternoon, that simple decision not to delete one email, that echoed loudest in my mind, because in that moment I finally understood that sometimes the smallest acts of quiet awareness matter more than any loud confrontation, and sometimes the truth doesn't need to be chased or exposed right away. It only needs to be preserved, protected, and allowed to wait until the moment arrives when it can no longer be ignored. The night of the launch party is burned into me in a way no amount of time, no quiet morning, no hard-earned peace will ever fully erase, because some moments don't just pass through your life, they carve themselves into it. And that night felt less like an event and more like a public ending, carefully wrapped in luxury and smiles, with lights bright enough to hide cruelty and champagne flowing freely enough to blur discomfort. And I remember walking into that downtown hotel ballroom feeling strangely out of place in a room I had helped make possible, surrounded by polished floors, crystal glasses clinking, laughter bouncing off high ceilings, and people dressed in confidence and money, all gathered to celebrate Laura's brand, her vision, her success. And she stood at the center of it all, glowing in a way I hadn't seen at home in years, confident, relaxed, powerful, soaking in admiration like it was oxygen. And I was there because she told me to be, because appearances still mattered even if truth didn't. And I told myself that this night might be a turning point, that maybe she would finally acknowledge the years I stood behind her, the doors I opened, the money I risked, the quiet support I gave without asking for credit. And when she called my name and motioned for me to come closer, my heart actually lifted for a brief second, because hope can survive longer than dignity if you let it. And I stepped forward thinking this was the moment where she would thank me, where she would tell the room who I was to her, where she would remind everyone that nothing rises alone. But instead she smiled a smile that felt sharp around the edges, the kind of smile that doesn't warm a room but controls it. And she made a joke about new beginnings, about letting go of the past, about shedding old weight to rise higher. And the words landed wrong before I even understood why. And then she reached out and placed a stack of papers in my hands as if it were a prop, laughing lightly as she did it, and told the room she was moving on, told them I was finished, told them she was finally free. And for a second the room didn't know how to react, because nobody expects real cruelty to arrive dressed as entertainment. And then people laughed, some nervously, some genuinely, because they thought this was part of the show, part of the bold image she was selling, and I stood there holding those papers while the sound of applause and laughter blurred together, feeling heat rush into my chest, feeling my jaw tighten, feeling the urge rise up to shout, to expose everything, to tear the mask off in front of everyone, because humiliation does that to you. It begs you to respond loudly just to feel human again. And in that moment I felt smaller than I ever had, not because I was weak, but because I was being erased publicly by someone who once promised to protect me, and I could feel eyes on me, curious eyes, pitying eyes, calculating eyes already deciding which side they were on, and I realized that this wasn't just a divorce announcement. This was a performance, a declaration of power meant to show everyone that she was untouchable and that I was already a thing of the past. And my hands trembled slightly as I held those papers, not from fear, but from the effort it took to stay still, to stay silent, to breathe, because somewhere between humiliation and heartbreak, something unexpected happened. Clarity arrived, sharp and calm, and I understood that if I reacted the way she wanted me to, angry, loud, emotional, I would only confirm the story she was telling about me. The story where I was weak, unstable, finished, and I saw it all in a flash. How carefully this moment had been planned, how the timing was chosen, how the audience was selected, how the laughter was meant to crush whatever dignity I had left. And in that instant I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I chose patience over pride, silence over spectacle, because I realized that the best response was not noise, it was restraint. And while people continued to clap and drink and celebrate around me, I stepped back, nodded once, and walked away with my head up, leaving behind a room full of people who thought they had just witnessed my end, not knowing they had only seen the moment where I stopped pretending and started waiting. And as I walked out into the cool night air, the sound of the party fading behind me, I felt a strange calm settle in, not because the pain wasn't real, but because the confusion was gone, because that night confirmed everything I had quietly suspected. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly who I was dealing with, exactly what she was willing to do, and exactly how carefully I would need to move from that point forward. And while that party was meant to bury me alive in front of everyone who mattered to her, it ended up doing something else entirely. It stripped away my illusions, hardened my resolve, and taught me that when someone is confident enough to humiliate you publicly, the smartest thing you can do is let them believe the story they are telling, because people who feel victorious stop watching their own steps. And that night, as I drove home alone with divorce papers on the passenger seat and the echo of laughter still ringing in my ears, I understood that patience was no longer just a personality trait. It was my strategy, and the party that was supposed to end me quietly marked the beginning of a much longer, much quieter reckoning. After that night, the world didn't explode the way movies make it seem. It didn't crash all at once. It simply went quiet in the most personal ways, and that silence told me more than any argument ever could, because people stopped calling almost immediately. Invitations that used to show up without effort suddenly disappeared. Group chats went still, and friends I had known for years, men whose houses I had helped build decks for, couples whose kids had called me uncle, suddenly seemed too busy to return a message. And at first that hurt more than the divorce itself, because it felt like I wasn't just losing a marriage. I was being quietly erased from a shared history, and Laura, meanwhile, moved with shocking speed. The locks on the house were changed before I had even fully processed the paperwork. Titles were transferred with a confidence that suggested long preparation, and pictures of her new life appeared online like a carefully curated victory lap. Smiling photos, elegant captions, comments filled with praise and support, all written as if I had never existed, as if the years we spent building something together were a minor inconvenience she had successfully overcome. And I watched it all without responding, without correcting the record, without defending myself. And from the outside it probably looked like I had collapsed, like I was too embarrassed or too broken to speak up, but the truth was far less dramatic and far more deliberate, because I wasn't silent out of weakness. I was silent out of focus. And while everyone else was busy forming opinions based on what they could see, I was watching what they couldn't, listening to what wasn't being said, and documenting details that didn't quite line up. And I spent long evenings alone, not spiraling, not drinking myself numb, but thinking clearly for the first time in years, replaying conversations, remembering dates, connecting small moments that had felt meaningless before. And in that quiet I reached out to one person Laura had forgotten about entirely. A man who had been around in the early days before success rewrote the story. Someone who remembered the long meetings, the informal discussions, the paperwork that was signed quickly without much thought, and when we met, quietly without drama, he confirmed something I had suspected but never fully allowed myself to believe, that not everything Laura now claimed as hers had been obtained the right way, that certain signatures were given under specific conditions that no longer existed, and that the confidence she was projecting rested on an assumption that nobody would ever question the foundation. And that knowledge didn't make me angry, it made me patient, because at my age I had learned a lesson life teaches slowly and often painfully. Rushing only helps the person who wants you to make mistakes, and reacting emotionally only gives your opponent the advantage they are hoping for. So I did nothing publicly. I let her confidence grow unchecked, let her tell her version of the story louder and louder, let her believe that silence meant surrender, because people who think they've already won stop being careful, they stop watching who they step over, they stop protecting the details that matter. And I understood that the higher someone stands on a lie, the more dangerous it becomes for them when the truth finally taps them on the shoulder. And during that time I learned how uncomfortable quiet can be in a loud world, how tempting it is to defend yourself when your reputation is being rewritten by someone else, how painful it is to watch people believe a version of you that isn't real. But I also learned something else, something powerful, that silence forces people to reveal themselves, that noise hides cracks while quiet exposes them. And as weeks turned into months, I watched Laura become bolder, more relaxed, less guarded, and I realized she no longer saw me as a threat, which was exactly where I needed to be, because while she was busy celebrating her freedom and enjoying the applause of people who only knew the surface, I was building something far less visible but far more solid, a clear understanding of the truth, a timeline that made sense, and a calm readiness to act when the moment was right. And going quiet in a loud world wasn't easy. It required swallowing pride, enduring misunderstanding, and trusting that the long game still mattered. But in that silence I found my footing. Again, not as her husband, not as the man she tried to erase, but as myself, steady, observant, and fully aware that the story was not over yet. It was simply waiting for the right chapter to turn. There is a strange and underestimated power in paperwork, a quiet authority that doesn't announce itself until it matters. And I learned that lesson the long way, through years of watching people skim pages, trust assumptions, and sign their names as if ink alone could never carry consequences. And years earlier, long before the launch parties, the applause, and the public humiliation, there had been a moment so ordinary it barely registered at the time. A moment when Laura trusted me completely, when we were still partners in the truest sense, when success had not yet taught her to rush or overlook details. And during that period she signed a document without reading it closely, not because she was careless, but because she trusted me and believed everything between us was aligned. And it looked like a standard form, one of many, buried in a stack of routine paperwork connected to early planning and asset protection, the kind of document people assume is boring and harmless, the kind lawyers prepare quietly and clients approve quickly. And she flipped through it with half attention, asked one casual question, signed where indicated, and handed it back without a second thought, never knowing that buried deep inside that document was a clause written in plain language but positioned where few people ever pause, a clause that tied specific assets to very clear conditions, conditions rooted in transparency, partnership, and intent, conditions that assumed honesty and mutual consent. And at the time none of it felt secretive or strategic. It was simply part of building something together, part of protecting what we had worked for. And I never mentioned that clause again, never highlighted it, never brought it up in conversation, not because I was hiding anything, but because there was nothing to hide. Everything was fair and balanced when it was signed. And as the years passed and Laura's success grew, as her confidence turned into boldness and her boldness turned into entitlement, she unknowingly stepped over every boundary that clause quietly protected, transferring things unilaterally, presenting joint assets as solely hers, making deals without disclosure, speaking publicly as if she alone had built everything from nothing. And with every move she made, she drifted further from the conditions she had once agreed to without hesitation. And I watched it happen without interruption, because I understood something most people don't, that reminding someone of a forgotten rule too early only teaches them how to avoid it. And I didn't need leverage, I didn't need confrontation, all I needed was time, because time has a way of letting patterns complete themselves. And when the moment finally came for me to sit down with my lawyer, not in anger, not in panic, but with a calm stack of documents and a clear timeline, and he read through everything slowly, carefully, then looked up at me and explained in plain English exactly what that forgotten signature meant, exactly how the conditions had been violated, Exactly why the confidence Laura projected rested on a legal foundation far weaker than she believed. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement, not triumph, not even satisfaction, but relief. The kind of relief that comes when confusion finally dissolves. Because it wasn't about winning or watching her lose, it was about knowing that the truth had been preserved exactly where it needed to be. Untouched, unaltered, waiting patiently for the moment it was needed. And in that realization I understood the deeper lesson hidden inside all of it. That the most powerful safeguards in life are often the quiet ones. The agreements made in good faith. The details overlooked by people who believe trust makes them invincible. And while Laura had been busy building a narrative where she stood alone at the top, that single signature she'd barely remembered carried the weight of the past. The intent of partnership and the limits she had crossed without realizing it. And I didn't feel the need to rush forward or announce anything. Because I knew now with certainty that the truth wasn't chasing her. It was waiting for her, sitting calmly in black and white, ready to speak for itself when the moment arrived. And in that waiting I found a steady calm, because when you know the foundation is solid, you don't need to shout, you don't need to threaten, and you don't need to remind anyone of what they forgot. You simply let the truth do what it has always done best. Stand quietly until someone finally tries to deny it. The final confrontation did not happen in a courtroom with wooden benches and raised voices the way most people imagine justice unfolding. It happened in a room designed for celebration. In another carefully staged event Laura hosted to remind the world how far she had risen and how untouchable she believed she was. And when I walked in that evening I could feel the shift before anyone said a word, because people noticed me in a way they hadn't for months. Not because I looked powerful or angry or dramatic, but because I looked calm, settled, unbothered, like a man who had already made peace with something everyone else was still guessing about. And that calm unsettled them, because confidence that doesn't ask for attention has a way of drawing it anyway. And as I moved through the room I could feel eyes following me, curious, cautious, whispering questions behind polite smiles, while Laura stood across the room surrounded by admirers, laughing loudly, performing ease, her confidence, almost theatrical, and I realized then how much she relied on noise to feel secure. How much her certainty depended on the room reflecting it back to her. And when the moment came it didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement or raised voices. It arrived quietly, deliberately, the way truth usually does when it has been waiting long enough, because documents don't need emotion to speak. They only need to be read, and as the conversation shifted and attention gathered without force, the email I had saved years earlier was presented in full, its careful wording exposed under neutral light, stripped of excuses and context, and I watched Laura's expression change not all at once but in small fractures, the kind you only notice when you've studied someone for decades, the tightening around her eyes, the way her smile lingered a second too long before fading, and then the witness spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, recounting moments Laura had assumed were forgotten, conversations she believed lived only in her control, and with each sentence the room seemed to shrink, laughter dissolving into silence. Glasses pausing halfway to lips, people leaning forward without realizing they were doing it. And then the clause was explained in plain language, the one buried in paperwork she never bothered to reread, the one tied to conditions she had confidently violated while believing no one would ever connect the dots. And that was the moment the air changed. Completely. The moment the room went still in a way that felt physical, heavy, pressing against the chest, because people weren't watching a scandal anymore. They were witnessing a narrative collapse in real time, and Laura's laughter, which had once filled rooms effortlessly, stopped mid-breath, her mouth slightly open as if words were lining up but couldn't find a way out, and for the first time since the launch party where she had laughed while handing me divorce papers, she had nothing to say, no joke to deflect with, no confident explanation ready, no crowd willing to laugh on cue, because truth does not need volume, it doesn't need timing or performance, it only needs space. And in that space everything she had taken began to unravel, not dramatically, not cruelly, but thoroughly and legally, like a knot finally loosened after being pulled too tight for too long. And I stood there without speaking, without smiling, without celebrating, because this moment was never about humiliation, it was about correction, about restoring what had been distorted. And as the implications settled in, I could see people reassessing their loyalties, their assumptions, the stories they had repeated without question, and Laura stood frozen, suddenly smaller without the echo of applause, finally facing a truth she had believed she could outgrow or outrun. And in that stillness I felt no rush of victory, only a deep sense of closure, because everything I had carried quietly for years, the patience, the restraint, the decision not to react when reacting would have felt good, had led to this exact moment where the truth spoke for itself and needed no help from me. And as the room slowly returned to motion, whispers replacing silence, I understood that this was the real ending of the story she tried to write without me, not because she lost everything publicly, but because she lost control of the narrative she had built on omission and confidence. And while people would later argue about who was right or wrong, what mattered to me was simpler, that in a room designed for noise, truth arrived quietly and stopped everything. And I walked away from that moment the same way I had walked into it, steady, unbothered, finally free from carrying a weight that no longer belonged to me. I did not cheer when it happened. I did not smile. I did not raise my head or lift my hands or give the room anything to react to, because in that moment I understood something deeply, that real turning points don't feel loud on the inside even when they look loud on the outside. And I simply stood there while the story rewrote itself in real time, watching faces shift as understanding replaced assumption, watching people mentally replay conversations they had with Laura, moments they had brushed off, claims they had accepted without question, and I could almost see the recalculation happening behind their eyes as they realized who had really built the foundation they were standing on, who had opened doors, who had provided stability long before success made everything look effortless. And it was strange to witness, because for so long I had been invisible to these same people, reduced to a background figure in a narrative that painted Laura as entirely self-made and me as excess weight she had bravely shed. And now, without me saying a word, without me asking for recognition, the truth was quietly rearranging the room. And when the applause finally came, it didn't erupt all at once. It didn't explode with excitement. It grew slowly, unevenly, as people realized what they were responding to. And it wasn't applause for revenge or embarrassment or spectacle. It was applause for clarity, for correction, for the sudden realization that the man they thought was destroyed had not been broken at all, only patient, only silent, only waiting for the right moment to let the truth stand on its own. And I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized I had been carrying for years, a tightness I had mistaken for strength, a constant pressure to endure quietly without being seen. And in that release there was no triumph, no urge to look at Laura or check her reaction, because that part of the story no longer mattered to me. What mattered was the feeling of being aligned again, of no longer having to hold two realities in my head at the same time, the one I lived and the one everyone else believed. And as the applause settled into murmurs and people began speaking again, softer now, more careful, I realized that justice, real justice, doesn't scream, it doesn't demand attention, it doesn't celebrate loudly, it settles, it brings things back into balance without asking permission. And standing there in that moment, finally unburdened, I understood that this wasn't about winning something I had lost. It was about getting my footing back after years of standing on uneven ground, about finally being able to breathe without bracing myself. And as people approached me afterward with quiet nods, with words that sounded like apologies disguised as compliments, I accepted them calmly, not because I needed validation, but because I no longer needed to explain myself. And for the first time since the laughter at that launch party, since the silence that followed, since the months of being misunderstood, I felt light, not euphoric, not proud, just light, as if something heavy had been set down gently instead of dropped. And in that feeling I knew the story had truly turned, not because applause changed direction, but because I no longer needed it to know where I stood. Now, looking back on everything, decades of memories, triumphs, failures, quiet nights spent thinking about choices and what-ifs, I understand clearly that this story is not about her downfall. It is about my awakening, about the kind of understanding that only comes when life has tested you in ways you never expected and left you standing with nothing but time to make sense of it. And I have learned that trust does not mean blindness, that believing in someone does not require you to ignore your instincts or the little details that whisper warnings in your ear, that patience is not weakness even when the world treats it like a flaw, because the quiet decisions you make, the careful observations, the restraint, all of that builds a strength that people who chase dramatic victories cannot comprehend. And I have realized that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is wait, watch, and allow truth to have its moment instead of forcing your own version of events onto the world. Because truth, when properly preserved and allowed to act in its own time, carries more weight than any argument, any shouting match, any desperate attempt to prove yourself in the moment. And looking at the years behind me, at the nights of loneliness, the months of silence, the careful gathering of evidence and witnesses, I can see that every small decision, Every restrained reaction, every piece of overlooked paperwork was part of a larger story that had to play out exactly as it did, teaching me that real justice does not need fanfare, it does not require emotion, it does not announce itself with fireworks or declarations. It simply arrives when it has been given the space to exist. And in that, I have found a peace that is rare and almost foreign after so many years of confusion and betrayal, because I no longer define myself by the losses I endured, nor by the humiliation I suffered, but by the clarity I cultivated and the discipline I exercised. And if there is one lesson I can pass on, one truth I have learned standing firmly in my 50s, it is that you should never underestimate the quiet person in the room, because they may not be plotting revenge, they may not be scheming in secret, they may simply be protecting the truth, guarding it carefully, making sure it is preserved for the exact moment it can no longer be ignored. And when that moment finally comes, when patience meets opportunity, the arrival of truth does not just change an ending. It changes everything. It shifts perspectives, rearranges assumptions, corrects narratives that were built on half-truths and selective memory, and it reminds everyone in the room, quietly but irrevocably, that what is real, what is authentic, cannot be rewritten or erased by confidence, charm, or theatrics. And standing here today, older, slower to anger, but sharper in understanding, I can say with certainty that the life I have built after those years of silence, observation, and careful patience is stronger and more grounded than it ever would have been if I had chosen to respond impulsively or seek immediate vindication. Because there is a power in restraint, a dignity in watching and waiting, and a reward in letting the universe, or in my case the careful preservation of truth, do the work that anger or pride never could. And so, as I sit quietly reflecting on what has happened, I feel no bitterness toward her, no desire to dwell on the wrongs endured, only a profound awareness of how much patience, observation, and a long memory can accomplish when wielded with steady hands and a clear mind. And if there is a final thought I want anyone reading or listening to carry with them, it is this: the quiet observer in the room, the one who appears passive, the one who endures, notices, and preserves, is often the one who holds the real power, because their strength is not built on noise, but on truth. And when that truth finally steps forward, it does not merely settle old scores or correct misconceptions. It transforms the very foundation of the story everyone thought they understood, reminding us that real wisdom, real justice, and real power often come not from being the loudest in the room, but from being the one who waits, who sees, who understands, and who allows the inevitable arrival of truth to speak for itself, changing not only outcomes but hearts, minds, and the way the world will remember the story long after the applause fades.